We're going to dive into the basics of what data integrity is, the most common migration pitfalls we see, and how you can create a good process. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your WebEx Q&A control panel. We'll have someone available to answer any questions, and also a recorded version of this webinar will be available at a later date. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it on over to you, Thomas.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for those of us on the East Coast. My name is Thomas Tschirhart, and what we're going to be covering today in this webinar is GMP data migration for dummies. I'm actually really excited to talk about this particular topic because I think data migration is something that is very interesting. Also, it has some gray areas, some ins and outs to it. So I think a webinar like this is very valuable for those of us interested in learning more about data migration. So we're going to go ahead and start moving through. As a quick introduction for myself, my name is Thomas. I'm Director of Business Development here for PSC Software. On the slide is my email address and my phone number. If you have any questions after the webinar, or if you just want to talk about data migration, give me a call, send me a text message, or of course, send me an email as well. And I'd love to answer questions and talk about data migration. Before we talk about that, though, I do want to go maybe just a little bit on who we are and why we're having this, this data migration webinar. So PSC Software, we're a trusted industry-leading cloud provider of quality management software with a particular focus on providing our software to pharmaceutical, medical device, and other companies, biotech companies, basically highly regulated industries and clients, right? We've been providing our software for over 13 years here into the market, seen a lot when it comes to data migrations, and we felt like putting on a webinar kind of talking about, you know, pitfalls and what is GMP data migration would be really valuable, because in our 13 years, we have executed many data migrations, either from a legacy software into our industry-leading quality management system, or helping clients just move their data, maybe not even into our own software. So a lot of experience and background that we feel we can bring to the table on this particular topic. But first, you know, let's talk about what is data integrity, because data integrity is a very critical concept when it comes to GMP data migrations. In particular, it's important for us to understand that according to the FDA, you know, data integrity refers to completeness, consistency, and accuracy of all of our data. And that's very critical. Those items are critical when we think about moving that data into a new system and maintaining our GMP compliance. You know, we're moving the complete data, it's being moved consistently, and it's being moved in an accurate manner. So we'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail on later slides. But data integrity is very critical when it comes to data migrations. There are some requirements for GMP compliant data and moving of that data. We've added some bullet points here. I mean, really, it's things that you would expect, right? But some of those items would be, you know, that the data is extracted in a complete and secure manner. You know, it's protected against alterations, accidental erasure, and losses, right? That documentation is being generated at the time of performance. Basically, we're not backdating our documentation, right? When it comes to laboratory data, you know, our controls are sound and complete, right? All the information from our test is captured. The full test result is captured for all of our tests. And when it comes to electronic signatures, everything is 21 CFR Part 11 compliant. There are we believe, five main pitfalls when it comes to data migration. These are some pitfalls that, we have built up or maybe encountered in our past. Again, thinking back in our experience, we've seen a lot when it comes to these data migrations. But, those five are maintaining Gmp compliance during the full migration. Poor data quality, so critical. The quality of the data, deficient documentation, and not having a good process in place during that migration, lack of communication, and then poor business planning and operational planning during that migration. Something very critical to think through is that business and operational planning. Let's go into each one of these in a bit more detail, though. The first pitfall, maintaining Gmp compliance, right? Great solution. Utilize consultants that are trained in data migration for Gmp regulated industries. Go out and start talking to people that know and have done Gmp migrations before, right? Because a lot of these topics that we're going to talk about later, they would have already encountered in their past executing Gmp data migrations. How you can maintain compliance would be finding the company or consultant that has data migration services and expertise, really trained professionals that they can bring to the table, bring that knowledge to the table to help you with your data migration. But keep in mind that a data migration, it's a joint effort. It's always a joint effort between yourself and the company that you might bring in to execute that data migration. Maybe it's your new provider of new software that you're bringing in-house. They might be that company that's doing the data migration for you. Just make sure that they know what they're doing, and always keep in the back of your mind that it's a joint effort between yourself and themselves when it comes to maintaining Gmp compliance and completing the data migration in a timely manner, right? Even though that company is going to be developing the migration plans, workflows, templates, protocols to execute that migration, and then executing the migration for you, the data does have to come from you, from the client, right? We've had situations in the past where the client might say, well, we don't have our data. We don't have it in order, right? Well, we can't migrate the data unless we're provided with the data, So again, just, it's always a joint effort. It doesn't matter. You can bring in, people with hundreds of years of experience with this combined, across the organization. But there's still going to be things that are expected of yourselves. And one of those bigger ones would be that the data's got to come from you, Speaking of that data, a second pitfall would be poor data quality, right? And this is very critical. Really just keep in mind as the solution, do a gap analysis ahead of time, right? Make that source data quality a priority. Very simple analogy, bad data in, bad data out, right? When you're thinking of that software that you're moving to, does it require that the data is in a particular format so that the migration can be done correctly? If it does, if that is the case, then make sure that that data that you're providing is in that right format. Otherwise, there might be problems that are encountered during the data migration that can increase the timeline, increase the cost of that overall migration engagement. Further, not just the formatting, but let's make sure all the records are there, right? Let's watch out for duplicates, misspellings, and other erroneous data. Probably the worst thing that can happen is that, you know, the data is pulled, provided to the company to do the data import, to complete the data migration, and then we find out later that not all the data was provided. And then there's another migration that needs to be done. But even more than that, a migration into a system that already has migrated GMP data, which just requires more testing and validation. So, you know, right from the get-go, think through how you're going to retrieve your data. Are you going to be retrieving complete data? And that might require performing a gap analysis before migrating your data to make sure that, hey, we have all the data and it's good quality data before we execute that GMP data migration. Pitfall number 3 would be not having a very strong process or strong understanding of a data migration process. And then kind of right underneath that, not having great documentation of that data migration process, right? You know, obviously the solution would be to have a strong migration plan, workflows, templates, and protocols all written ahead of time, or rely on, you know, the company that's providing you the software program that you're moving the data into, or your consulting company to bring that expertise and that process knowledge into your organization so that the data migration can be executed as flawlessly as possible. Here is what we feel is a good migration plan. This is a data migration plan that we have generally developed based on our, you know, over a decade of experience working with clients and executing data migrations for them. Really, there's 3 main steps, right? Step 1, let's author the migration plan, receive the data from the client. Step 2, scrub that client data, and then execute the data migration. Step 3, complete all data testing, provide the final reports for that GMP data migration. So obviously you can see in each of these, there's a couple of sub-steps and bullet points. I won't read through all of them. I'm just going to cherry pick some of the most important ones. But when it comes to authoring that migration plan and receiving the data from the client, that's step 1, right? Probably some of the most important bullet points that we had listed here are defining responsibilities, right? Kind of going back to one of those earlier pitfalls, who is doing what, right? Okay, so we need to get the company the data to execute the data migration. Is there a particular format that that data needs to be provided in? Do we internally have identified our people who are responsible for retrieving that data from our legacy system, right? Do they know how to go about retrieving that data? On the other side, you know, on I would say our side or consulting company side, it's going to be for us authoring and reviewing the migration plan with the client, making sure that all of the documentation for the migration plan is written, reviewing that migration plan with the client so that everyone knows exactly what the plan is, and then getting all of the approvals that are needed before we start the data migration work so that everyone knows what the plan is, everyone's in agreement, everything's documented to execute the plan in step 2. In that second step, probably the biggest item would be executing the data migration following an order of operations. That's kind of how we think of it here. But if we just take, for example, for me to explain this bullet point a little bit more, let's take the example of moving control documents, GMP documentation, our standard operating procedures, our policies, information like that, right? let's say we're moving from an old system, an old legacy document system, into a new modern document management software. Well, there is an order of operations that we need to follow to move those documents. For example, as we're moving those documents from the old system into the new system, we're going to be filling out various data capture fields, like who's the author for the document, who are quality approvers, or any other approvers for that particular document, right? Well, first and foremost, before we can even create those document records in the new system, we first have to create the users in the system so that when we go fill out the document record, we can, of course, put the author in that author field, right? So there is kind of like a general order of operations when it comes to migrating data. Generally, it's, you know, all of the users first and foremost, then all the data fields, then the documents themselves, and then after that, if this software also incorporates training elements, all of the training information beyond that. I mean, you can't really assign training to users if you don't have their user accounts made, right? So just thinking through, you know, when it comes to a data migration, the actual execution of it, there might be multiple sub-migrations that are dependent on each other, you know, users before documents, before training, for example. And then lastly, you know, when it comes to completing that data migration, providing the final data migration report, right? I would say the sub-bullet point 1 and 3 are going to be the most important here. You know, performing the automated and manual GMP data integrity testing following a widely accepted standard. In our case here at PSC Software, we follow ASQ sampling methodology. That is what we follow to determine how many documents and records need to be opened and reviewed and sampled, and then documented, of course, to show that data integrity has been maintained. Kind of going back to some of those earlier slides, we're talking about accuracy and consistency, following a consistent sampling methodology that proves the accuracy of the data migration. And then, of course, in that third bullet point, and at the end of the data migration, authoring and reviewing with the client the data migration results, and then the final data migration report, you know, making sure that all of the results are clear, the final report is clear, all of the execution data is captured, the sampling has been completed, and that the client understands everything around that sampling and the documentation that's been written. And then, of course, and this is, I think, kind of tied into that data migration process, we've been talking about a lot of document writing, a lot of sampling and evidence capturing to support the GMP nature of this type of documentation. Hey, we start thinking about Alcoa, right? That all of our documentation is attributable, legible, contemporaneously recorded, it's original or true copy, and it's accurate, right? Again, we just want to make sure that all of the documentation that is proving the integrity of the data migration is correct, you know, legible, and can be attributable to specific people through signatures, either, you know, wet signature, electronic signature, and accurate. You know, we need accurate documentation to support the data migration itself. Pitfall number 4 would probably be lack of communication and collaboration. You know, this really kind of ties back into some concepts we talked about earlier in the webinar, defining responsibilities, involving all of the concerned parties and understanding that data migration process, all stakeholders, need to understand that process. Really, how we approach this is we clearly outline and define our responsibilities, or we could say the consulting company's responsibilities, and then the client's responsibilities when it comes to the data migration itself. And some of those would be, on the consulting company side, that they're aware that they're going to be offering and writing those migration plans and protocols, that they're testing that data migration import template and then the data after the template for any problems, even before the migration is performed, right? That they're sampling those records following an industry standard sampling methodology and writing those full summary reports. On the client side, hey, review those documents. Make sure that you understand that migration plan and protocol. Provide that data in the approved, or maybe if formatting is needed, formatted templates so that the data migration runs smoothly. And kind of going back to the previous slide talking about responsibilities, I'll just say again, who's responsible for getting that data out of the legacy system, if needed, to format that data into the import templates? And again, just, having those responsibilities clearly delineated within the organization is so critical to having a smooth data migration, because kind of going back even a couple slides earlier, poor data in, poor data out, right? This is one where I would say an ounce of pain is better than a pound of cure, right? It's more worth everyone's time to spend 10 hours up front scrubbing data, making sure these templates are filled out correctly, rather than spending 100 hours post-migration dealing with problems because of poorly formatted data, missing data, things like that. So very critical to have those responsibilities delineated within the organization. Hey, providing access to the data for migration, pretty well understood. And then reviewing the data migration summary report at the end of the migration, right? Making sure that everything is correct and everything is documented. And go back a slide, that, Alcoa has been followed for all the documents that have been written and generated for the data migration. I would say probably the last pitfall here, pitfall number 5, is business operational planning, right? Go into the data migration with a reasonable and achievable operational plan before we start the data migration. And here's exactly what we mean. When you're getting that data out of the legacy system, we might pull that data on the 1st of the month, right? And then we provide that data, we scrub it, the data migration is done, the sampling is done, all of the paperwork, the plans, the protocols are all written and approved, and okay, we're done. And it took us 2 months to complete that data migration. We pulled it the 1st of the month of April, we complete the data migration at the end of May. Great, awesome. But of course, our business didn't shut down during those 2 months, right? So build an operational plan to try and minimize your use of that legacy system during that 2-month period of the data migration. Because if we don't, and we're using that legacy system heavily during those 2 months, then what happens is at the end of the 2 months, the data migration's done, but we got 2 months of data that needs to be brought forward into the new system. And then what does that mean? Another migration, potentially. And then, okay, now we need to do a month's worth of data because the data set was smaller, you know, in the second migration. So then what? Do we do a third migration? A fourth migration? There has to come a time where, you know, we plan and we say, look, and I'll talk about control documents and document management software, right? Let's not make a lot of edits and revisions to documents during that 2-month period of the migration. Let's build a business plan to either make all of our documentation updates before the migration started or after the migration is completed, so that, again, we can use that legacy system as little as possible so that there's less of a delta after that initial migration is performed, right? So basically, work with your team, work with the business, your stakeholders, think through that operational plan, right? And how we can minimize the use of that legacy software that we're moving away from, especially during that data migration, right? It really cuts down on redundant work after that migration, which of course can add, you know, a lot of time into that overall timeline to complete the move to the new software. Those were really the 5 data migration pitfalls. I wanted to talk just really quick about how we can help when it comes to data migration. You know, like I mentioned before, we have 13 years of industry experience. We've worked with many pharmaceutical, medical device, and other highly regulated companies moving their data from systems to systems, from a legacy system into our software, or from a legacy system into another software that they're bringing in-house. You know, we can use our industry experience and help companies understand and build that data migration process and help them think through questions that they might want to ask, you know, that consulting company that they might be bringing on board to help with that data migration. Of course, we do have software solutions directly that we provide in the realm of quality management, you know, document management, training, systems like that. If a company is using a legacy quality system, hey, maybe looking at one of the quality systems that we have that are widely used in the industry might be a good solution, along with our data migration expertise to help them move from that legacy system into industry-leading quality management software. With that, hey, that really kind of wraps up the webinar. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I had my direct contact information at the beginning of the PowerPoint here, but we did want to add more general contact information here at the end. If you do have any more questions, please don't hesitate to email us at sales@biotech.com or give us a phone call at 206-677-8080. You know, we have a lot of deep expertise, and we can bring that expertise to bear on any data migrations that you might be considering or are currently undertaking. So don't hesitate to give us a call. With that, again, thank you so much for your time. Hope you have a great rest of the Thursday, and look forward to talking with you again soon at the next webinar 2 weeks from now. Have a great day. Bye.